The roar of jet engines filled the sky as the F-4 Phantom sliced through the clouds, its sleek frame cutting through the air like a blade. At the control sat a man whose reputation was as formidable as the aircraft he commanded. Robin Olds wasn't just any fighter pilot. He was a legend, a leader, and a warrior who lived for the thrill of the fight. His story wasn't just about flying. It was about defiance, strategy, and a relentless pursuit of victory. Every mission he took, every maneuver he perfected, was driven by an unbreakable will and a deep understanding of air combat. But beneath the iconic mustache and the larger-than-life persona was a man who carried the weight of responsibility. A man who knew that one wrong move in the skies could mean the difference between life and death. Robin Olds was the complete fighter pilot package, skillful, fearless, and strategic. He wasn't just born into the military, he embodied it. With a father who was an early military aviator, Olds had aviation in his blood, and from the moment he first climbed into a cockpit, he knew he was meant to fly. But being a great pilot wasn't just about handling an aircraft. It was about understanding the battle, outthinking the enemy, and leading with both strength and instinct. In World War II, Olds made a name for himself as an aggressive and innovative pilot, but it was in Vietnam that his legend truly took shape. He didn't just fly missions, he redefined aerial combat. During the Vietnam War, the skies were more dangerous than ever. The North Vietnamese Air Force, armed with MiG-17s and MiG-21s, had become a serious threat, and American pilots were struggling against their hit-and-run tactics. U.S. air strategy needed to change, and Olds knew it. He had seen too many young pilots fall victim to outdated tactics, and he wasn't about to let his men suffer the same fate. He was determined to take the fight to the enemy in a way they would never expect. That's when Operation Bolo was born, an operation that would go down in history as one of the most brilliant aerial ambushes ever executed. Operation Bolo wasn't just about flying into combat. It was about deception, strategy, and forcing the enemy into a trap they couldn't escape. Olds and his fellow pilots disguised their F-4 Phantoms as vulnerable bombing aircraft, tricking the North Vietnamese into launching their MiGs against what they thought would be an easy target. But when the MiGs took the bait, they were met with something they hadn't expected: highly skilled American pilots who had been waiting for this exact moment. Within minutes, the skies turned into a battlefield, and Olds led his squadron in a flawless execution of aerial dominance. By the time the battle was over, 7 enemy MiGs had been shot down without a single U.S. loss. It was a defining moment, proving that skill and strategy could turn the tide of war. But Robin Olds' story wasn't just about his victories in the air. It was about his battles on the ground as well. While he had earned the respect of his fellow pilots, he constantly found himself at odds with the bureaucracy of the Air Force. His aggressive approach, his refusal to play politics, and his insistence on speaking his mind often put him at odds with higher-ups. He wasn't interested in ranks or titles. He cared about results, about keeping his men alive, about making sure that American pilots had the best training, the best tactics, and the best leadership possible. But not everyone saw things the way he did. And as much as he dominated in the skies, the battles he fought within the military structure were just as intense. Despite the challenges, Robin Olds remained a pilot first and foremost. He lived for the cockpit, for the rush of a dogfight, for the split-second decisions that separated victory from defeat. Every mission he flew carried the weight of history, but also the weight of knowing that the men who flew beside him were putting their trust in his leadership. And as much as he was a warrior, he was also a mentor, someone who pushed his men to be better, who demanded excellence, and who refused to let fear dictate the fight. As his career unfolded, so did the challenges. He had proven himself time and again, but with every success came new obstacles. The war was changing, the rules of engagement were shifting, and even though he had mastered the art of aerial combat, the battles he faced on the ground were becoming just as intense. Robin Olds was a man caught between two worlds, the pilot who lived for the fight, and the leader who had to navigate the political game he never wanted to play. The question was, how long could he keep flying before the weight of it all became too much? And in a world that was rapidly evolving, would his tactics and leadership still have a place? Or was the era of the true fighter pilot coming to an end? The sky had always been his battlefield, but the real fight was only just beginning. Robin Olds had always believed that a true fighter pilot wasn't just someone who could fly. They had to think, react, and adapt in ways that couldn't be taught in a classroom. For him, flying was as much about instinct as it was about training, and no amount of military regulations or bureaucratic red tape would ever change that. From the moment he first took to the skies, he understood that air combat wasn't just about skill with the stick. It was about reading the enemy, predicting their next move, and striking before they even realized they were in danger. That mindset had served him well in World War II, but now, in Vietnam, he was facing a different kind of challenge. Unlike the large-scale air battles of the past, Vietnam was a war of unpredictability. The North Vietnamese pilots were trained by the Soviets, and they had learned to use speed, deception, and ambush tactics to level the playing field against American air power. The U.S. had superior aircraft, better technology, and more firepower, but the enemy had something just as valuable: patience. They rarely engaged unless they had the advantage, striking quickly and disappearing before the Americans could react. It frustrated Olds to see young pilots being sent into combat with outdated tactics, relying on strategies that had worked in past wars, but were no match for the hit-and-run nature of the North Vietnamese. He knew something had to change. As a commander, Olds wasn't the kind of leader who sat behind a desk and gave orders from a safe distance. He flew alongside his men, led from the front, and made it his mission to understand the fight as they experienced it. He listened to their frustrations, heard their concerns, and knew exactly what they were up against. Many of them were fresh out of flight school, barely in their 20s, and being thrown into a war that didn't follow the rules they had trained for. Olds could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the hesitation, the uncertainty that came with knowing the enemy was out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But that was where Olds was different. He didn't believe in hesitation. He had a saying that summed up his entire approach to combat. The first time you think about it is the last time you'll ever think. In the air, hesitation got you killed. You had to trust your instincts, act without fear, and commit to every move as if your life depended on it, because it did. He drilled that mindset into every pilot under his command, pushing them harder, demanding more, and making sure that when the time came, they would react without thinking. Still, Olds wasn't just a warrior, he was a strategist. He had always known that the key to victory in air combat wasn't just about being the better pilot. It was about controlling the fight before it even began. That's what led him to develop one of the most daring operations of the war, Operation Bolo. It was a simple but brilliant concept. Use deception to lure the enemy into a fight they couldn't win. The North Vietnamese had grown overconfident in their tactics, believing that their hit-and-run ambushes could keep them ahead of the Americans. Olds decided it was time to change the game. The plan was set. His squadron would disguise their F-4 Phantoms as vulnerable F-105 bombers, knowing that the enemy wouldn't be able to resist attacking what they believed to be easy targets. But when the MiGs swooped in for the kill, they would be met with something they hadn't expected: fully armed and combat-ready Phantoms waiting to strike. It was a calculated risk, but Olds knew that wars weren't won by playing it safe. As the day of the operation approached, tension ran high. Every pilot in Old's squadron knew what was at stake. They weren't just flying another mission, they were changing the course of the air war. If it worked, they would deal a devastating blow to the enemy's air force. If it failed, they would be walking into an ambush of their own. Olds didn't show it, but he understood the weight of the moment. He had been in countless dogfights, had seen the chaos of aerial combat up close, but even he knew that this mission was different. The night before the mission, Olds walked through the flight line, speaking with his pilots one by one. He didn't give long speeches or try to inspire them with dramatic words. He just reminded them of why they were there, why they had trained so hard, and what they were fighting for. He had always believed that a good leader didn't just give orders. He stood beside his men, shared their risks, and led by example. That was exactly what he intended to do. As dawn broke, the pilots climbed into their cockpits, their helmets on, their hands steady on the controls. The engines roared to life, the heat shimmering off the runway as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Olds took a deep breath, glancing at his wingmen as they taxied into position. The trap was set, the enemy was waiting, and within minutes, the skies over Vietnam would erupt in a battle that would be remembered for generations. But the enemy was also watching. And what Olds didn't know was that the North Vietnamese had begun to suspect that something was different. The question was, had they figured out the trap before it had even been sprung? As the F-4 Phantoms lifted off the runway, their engines roaring with raw power, Robin Olds kept his focus razor sharp. The sky ahead was quiet, deceptively calm, but he knew that could change in an instant. This wasn't just another mission. This was a carefully laid trap, one that required precise execution. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the entire operation could backfire. He had drilled the plan into his squadron relentlessly, ensuring every pilot understood the strategy down to the smallest detail. Now, all that was left was to wait and see if the enemy would take the bait. Inside his cockpit, Olds glanced at his radar, scanning for any sign of approaching MiGs. The North Vietnamese had developed a habit of staying hidden until they saw an opportunity too good to pass up. They wouldn't just charge in recklessly. They would watch, assess, and only engage when they believed they had the upper hand. That's exactly what Olds was counting on. The disguised Phantoms flew in tight formation, mimicking the usual pattern of vulnerable F-105 bombers. To any enemy radar operator watching, this looked like an easy target. A group of slow, heavily loaded aircraft ripe for an ambush. The real question was whether the MiGs would believe it. Back at the enemy air base, the North Vietnamese commanders were already tracking the incoming American aircraft. For weeks, they had been studying U.S. flight patterns, looking for weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This formation looked like a gift, an unescorted strike package heading straight into contested airspace. Yet something felt off. The number of aircraft was slightly higher than usual, and the spacing was different. Some of the more experienced pilots hesitated, sensing something wasn't right. But orders were orders. The scramble command was given, and within minutes, a squadron of MiG-21s was airborne, racing toward what they believed to be an easy kill. Olds' radio crackled with a report from one of his wingmen. Multiple bogeys inbound. Looks like they took the bait. His grip tightened around the control stick, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for. His squadron continued flying as if nothing was wrong, maintaining their disguise until the last possible second. The enemy was closing in fast, their confidence growing as they prepared to strike. Olds could almost picture the expressions on their faces, focused, eager, convinced they had the advantage. But then, at the perfect moment, everything changed. "Break now," Olds commanded, And in an instant, the F-4 Phantoms snapped into aggressive combat maneuvers. The slow, defenseless bombers the MiGs had been expecting suddenly transformed into lethal fighters, ready to strike. The enemy pilots were caught off guard, their formation breaking apart in confusion. In that split second of hesitation, Olds and his men seized control of the fight. Missiles streaked across the sky, afterburners flared, and the once quiet airspace erupted into a full-scale battle. The Michu pilots, realizing they had been tricked, scrambled to regain their footing. Some attempted to turn and flee, but Olds was already on them. He selected his target, locked onto the nearest MiG, and fired. His missile tore through the sky, striking the enemy jet and sending it spiraling downward in a ball of fire. But Olds knew this fight wasn't over. The enemy was adapting, pushing back, trying to turn the ambush against them. One of his wingmen, a young but skilled pilot, found himself in trouble. 2 MiGs were closing in on him fast. Olds didn't hesitate. He pulled his Phantom into a sharp turn, pushing the aircraft to its limits as he raced to support his comrade. The enemy jets were skilled, moving in perfect synchronization, but Olds had faced worse odds before. With precise maneuvering, he lined up his next shot, squeezing the trigger just as the enemy jet made its move. Another kill. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, the fight continued to intensify. Some of the younger American pilots found themselves in their first real dogfight, experiencing the sheer chaos and adrenaline of air combat. For some, their training took over, instincts kicking in as they engaged the enemy with precision. For others, the shock of battle was overwhelming. Olds could hear the tension in their voices over the radio, the mix of excitement and fear as they fought for their lives. Back at the North Vietnamese command center, frustration grew. Their ambush had been turned against them, their pilots struggling against the superior strategy and firepower of the F-4 Phantoms. The Americans had caught them completely off guard, something they hadn't thought possible. But they weren't ready to give up. Orders were given to send reinforcements. More MiGs scrambled from the ground, racing toward the battlefield. The balance of power was about to shift again. Olds knew they couldn't afford to get comfortable. The enemy was adapting, and the fight was far from over. The moment they lost their edge, the moment they underestimated their opponents, everything could turn against them. He took a deep breath, scanning the chaotic sky around him. This battle wasn't just about skill. It was about survival, about proving that strategy and courage could outmatch even the most determined enemy. Then over the radio came a chilling warning. New contacts inbound. More bandits closing fast. The fight was only just beginning. Old's eyes darted to his radar screen. The new enemy contacts were closing in fast, more MiGs, fresh and eager to turn the tide. His breathing steadied, his grip tightening around the control stick. They had drawn the enemy out, but now they were in the thick of it, deep in contested airspace with limited room to maneuver. Every second counted. He keyed his radio, his voice sharp and clear. "Stay sharp, keep your formations tight. We're not done yet." The response from his pilots was immediate, acknowledgments crisp, steady. These were some of the best men he had flown with, but even the best could be overwhelmed when the odds started shifting. The fight had been in their favor moments ago, but now the enemy was adapting, pressing forward with greater coordination. The battlefield was turning into a swirling mass of contrails, missile streaks, and tracer fire. Olds yanked his Phantom into a steep climb, looking to regain altitude and an advantage. Below him, a young wingman was caught in a deadly game of survival. A MiG-21 was locked onto him, closing the distance with rapid precision. Old's instincts screamed at him to intervene, but he knew the worst thing he could do was break formation and dive in recklessly. "Stay calm," he called over the radio. Chink left, Now, now. The young pilot obeyed instantly, jerking his aircraft into a hard turn just as a missile streaked past where he had been a fraction of a second earlier. Olds seized the opportunity. He rolled his Phantom over, diving in behind the enemy fighter. The Michu pilot must have realized his mistake too late. Olds had him in his sights. But just as he prepared to fire, another enemy jet flashed into view from above, dropping in fast. A second MiG had been hunting him while he was focused on his kill. He had no time to think, only react. Olds slammed his throttle forward, pushing his Phantom into a desperate, evasive roll. Cannon fire ripped through the space where he had been a heartbeat earlier. The enemy pilot was skilled, sticking close to Old 6, refusing to let him shake free. G-forces crushed against him as he pulled into a brutal maneuver, his vision narrowing at the edges. He couldn't let this MiG dictate the fight. He had to turn the tables. His radio crackled with another warning. "Lead, you've got 2 more closing on your position. You need to clear out now." Olds didn't acknowledge. He knew the situation. He was deep in it. But retreat wasn't an option, not yet. Around him, his squadron was still locked in a furious battle. The fight had spread out, dogfights breaking off into smaller, intense one-on-one duels. His men were holding their own, but the enemy had numbers on their side now. It was becoming a test of endurance, of who could outlast the other. Then something changed. The sky ahead was shifting, flashes of silver moving at an angle that sent a spike of adrenaline through Olds' veins. More MiGs. Reinforcements. This wasn't just a last-ditch effort from the enemy. This was something else. A coordinated strike, a full-force push to overwhelm them completely. If they didn't start pulling out soon, they wouldn't have the chance at all. But how do you disengage when you're already surrounded? That was the question that hung over him like a storm cloud. Olds stole a glance at his fuel gauge. They had minutes before they had to start thinking about making it back. The battle wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about surviving. His mind raced, calculating options, weighing risks. He needed to make a decision, and fast. The enemy wasn't giving them space to breathe, and if they didn't break free now, they might never get the chance. His radio buzzed again. His men were waiting for the call. And then in the chaos of it all, he made his choice. Olds took a deep breath, his mind racing through possibilities. The enemy had the numbers, the positioning, and now, the advantage of reinforcements. But if there was one thing he knew, it was that air combat wasn't just about firepower. It was about deception, about making the enemy think they had control until they didn't. He keyed his mech. "Everyone, listen up. We're shifting tactics. Follow my lead." There was no time for hesitation. He rolled his Phantom hard to the left, diving toward the thickest cluster of enemy fighters. To anyone watching, it looked reckless, almost suicidal. The MiGs latched onto him immediately, drawn to what seemed like an easy kill. But Olds wasn't planning to be anyone's easy target. His maneuver was bait. The second the enemy committed to chasing him, his wingmen swooped in from above, hitting them from the blind spot they had exposed in their eagerness to take him down. Missiles streaked through the sky, and one after another, 2 MiGs exploded in fiery flashes. But the move had only bought them a few seconds. The enemy was adapting, closing in fast, and the radio was alive with frantic voices. His men were running out of options. Then something happened that made Olds' blood run cold. A new voice crackled over the radio, one that didn't belong to his squadron. It was calm, steady, and speaking in perfect English. "Phantoms, this is your last warning. Turn back now." A chill ran through him. The North Vietnamese Air Force wasn't known for using English radio transmissions. Whoever this was, they weren't just enemy pilots. They were highly trained, possibly even foreign advisors. Olds had heard rumors that some of the enemy MiGs were being flown by pilots from outside Vietnam, veterans with experience from other conflicts. If that was true, it meant they were up against an entirely new level of skill. Before he could respond, two MiGs broke from the main formation and came straight for him with perfect coordination. They weren't just attacking. They were executing a precise, rehearsed maneuver, one designed to cut off every possible escape route. Olds clenched his jaw. He had fought some of the best pilots in the world, but this was different. This was something else. The first MiG fired, forcing Olds to break right. The second was waiting, already anticipating his move. It was a trap, one he couldn't easily escape. His only chance was to do something unpredictable. He slammed his stick forward, cutting power just enough to make his Phantom sink suddenly, like a bird hit mid-flight. For a split second, the enemy pilots hesitated. It was all he needed. He reignited full power and pulled up sharply, reversing the trap back on them. His missile lock warning blared in his cockpit, but he ignored it. He had a target, and he wasn't letting it go. He squeezed the trigger, and his sidewinder leaped from its rail, streaking toward the MiG in front of him. The enemy pilot saw it coming too late. The explosion rocked the sky, sending debris spiraling in all directions. But there was no time to celebrate. The second MiG was still there, and this one wasn't breaking off. It was locked onto him, pressing the attack. Olds pushed his aircraft into a desperate roll, trying to shake the enemy's missile lock, but the MiG wasn't letting up. And that's when he realized something terrifying. The enemy wasn't trying to win the dogfight. They were trying to drag him deeper into enemy airspace. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a full-blown trap, designed to lure him and his squadron so far into hostile territory that escape would be impossible. He glanced at his fuel gauge. They were dangerously low. They couldn't stay in this fight much longer. If they didn't start pulling back now, they might not make it home at all. But retreat wasn't as simple as turning around. The enemy had planned for this, herding them toward the densest anti-air defenses. And worst of all, they had no idea what else was waiting for them beyond the horizon. Olds gritted his teeth. He had been in tight spots before, but this was something new. And the worst part, he had the sinking feeling that they had just walked into the most dangerous fight of their lives. Olds knew they had seconds to make a decision. The enemy had driven them deeper into hostile airspace, and their fuel reserves were running low. If they hesitated now, they wouldn't make it back. He took a deep breath, scanning his radar one last time. More enemy fighters were closing in. They weren't just trying to shoot them down. They were cutting off every possible escape route. "Listen up," Olds called over the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We break west on my mark. Full afterburners, no hesitation. If we stay, we die." His wingman didn't argue. They trusted him, and they had no choice. Olds suddenly yanked his stick to the right, braking hard and climbing straight into the sun. The blinding glare was just enough to throw off the enemy's targeting for a split second. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed. His squadron followed, their Phantoms roaring toward the edge of enemy airspace. Missiles streaked past them, explosions flashing dangerously close, but they kept moving, pushing their aircraft to the limit. But then, just as Olds thought they might make it out, his warning alarm screamed again. A fresh wave of MiGs had positioned themselves ahead, waiting for them. The trap had been deeper than he realized. It was a no-win scenario, outnumbered, low on fuel, and no backup in sight. His squadron had fought with everything they had, but it seemed like this was where it ended. Olds tightened his grip on the stick, already forming a plan for one last desperate move. If they were going down, they were going down fighting. Then, out of nowhere, his radio crackled to life. "Phantom Flight, we've got your backs." At first, he thought he was hearing things. Then through the clouds, friendly aircraft appeared, F-4 Phantoms, just like theirs. Reinforcements. Someone back at base must have realized what was happening and sent help. The tables turned in an instant. The enemy, sensing the shift, hesitated just long enough for Olds and his men to take advantage. His squadron flipped their aircraft around, launching a counterattack with renewed energy. Missiles locked on, sidewinders fired, and suddenly, the MiGs weren't the ones hunting anymore. They were the ones being chased. Olds found his target, a MiG that had been stalking him since the fight began. He locked on and fired. The missile streaked through the sky and struck its mark. The explosion was massive, debris scattering as the enemy fighter spiraled downward. One by one, the remaining MiGs broke away, disappearing into the clouds. The trap had failed. Olds and his squadron were battered, low on fuel, but alive. They turned west, racing back toward safety. But just as he allowed himself a moment to breathe, something on his radar caught his eye. A single blip, moving fast. Too fast. "Bogey, 6 o'clock, closing fast," came a warning over the radio. Olds twisted in his seat, searching the sky. And then he saw it, a lone MiG, faster than the others, angling for a perfect attack position. Where had it come from? Every instinct screamed that this wasn't an ordinary enemy pilot. This was someone skilled, someone who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The MiG fired. Olds reacted instantly, rolling his Phantom into a brutal dive. The missile missed by inches, but the enemy pilot wasn't giving up. This wasn't just another dogfight. This was personal. For long seconds, the two aircraft twisted and turned through the sky, locked in a deadly duel. Olds' fuel warning light flashed red. He had one chance. He pulled into a steep climb, forcing the MiG to follow. It was risky. If he miscalculated, he'd stall out. But if he was right, the enemy pilot wouldn't be able to keep up. The MiG hesitated at the last second. That was all Olds needed. He rolled inverted, flipped over the top, and suddenly he was the one behind. His thumb pressed down. A missile launched. The Meiju pilot tried to evade, but it was too late. The explosion lit up the sky. The final threat was gone. Olds exhaled sharply, his body tense with adrenaline. His squadron reformed, battered but victorious. The fight was over. But as they flew back toward base, Olds couldn't shake a single thought. That last MiG, it had been different. Smarter. More dangerous. Who had been flying it? He didn't have an answer. And maybe he never would. But one thing was certain, this war wasn't over yet. As Olds and his squadron cruised back toward base, the silence over the radio was heavy. No one needed to speak. They had all just been through one of the toughest fights of their lives, and the weight of it sat on their shoulders. The fuel warning light continued to blink, but at this point, it wasn't just about the aircraft, it was about them. About the mental exhaustion creeping in after pushing their limits for so long. The runway came into view at last, and one by one, the Phantoms touched down, their tires screeching against the pavement. As soon as Olds climbed out of the cockpit, he could feel the stiffness in his limbs, the tension still lingering from the battle. Ground crews swarmed around the aircraft, checking for damage and refueling, but for Olds, there was only one thing on his mind, that last Meiji. Inside the debriefing room, the squadron gathered, still processing what had just happened. The intelligence officers played back radar footage, marking enemy movements and trying to piece together what had gone wrong. It was clear that the enemy had anticipated them, setting up a trap that nearly succeeded. But that lone MiG, the one that had stayed behind when the others fled, was still an enigma. One of the intelligence officers looked up from the radar screen. That last pilot, he wasn't just good. He was exceptional. Whoever he was waiting for you. Olds nodded, not surprised. He had felt it in the air, the precision, the patience, the sheer skill behind every move that pilot made. It wasn't luck that had nearly taken him down. It was experience. The conversation shifted to strategy, to what they could learn from this fight, and how they could be better prepared next time. Because there would be a next time. The war didn't pause just because they had made it home today. There would always be another mission, another enemy waiting just beyond the horizon. Later that night, Olds sat alone by the flight line, watching the lights of the airbase flicker in the darkness. The distant hum of jet engines was a familiar sound, one that had become as natural as breathing. He thought about the men who had flown with him today, the ones who had trusted him to lead them home. He thought about the pilots who weren't so lucky, those who had given everything in the fight for the skies. He had seen war from every angle, had fought it, had lost friends to it, had even outplayed it on some occasions. But it never changed. No matter how many victories they claimed, there was always something unpredictable waiting, something they couldn't prepare for. Maybe that was the real test, not just surviving, but knowing that every mission could be their last in flying anyway. The next morning, he was back in the cockpit. There was no ceremony, no grand moment of reflection. Just another mission, another day in the life of a fighter pilot. But as he lifted off the runway, the weight of the previous battle still fresh in his mind, he knew one thing for certain: he would be ready. No matter what was waiting out there, no matter who was flying against him, he would be ready. Because that was the life of a fighter pilot. And Robin Olds wouldn't have had it any other way.